chat, and I can try to answer them as we go, or I can save some for the end. And then, yes, as this meeting is being recorded, please don't enter any personal information, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers into the chat, anything like that. So, yeah, with that being said, welcome, and I will turn it over to our presenter today, Miss Elizabeth Roble. So, take it away, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Roble. I'm a attorney in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm with the law firm Roble and Smith. Uh, One of the areas that I spend a lot of my time helping clients with is long-term care insurance. I help them understand their policy benefits, as well as assist them when they have a dispute and they're trying to get benefits. So I'm going to cover a lot of different things today. So hopefully you'll understand more about long-term care insurance policies, how to submit claims, and then also I'm going to talk you through what happens if there's a denial, and I'm going to give you an example of one of my cases. So let's get started. One of the things I like to cover is what is long-term care insurance? Sometimes it's confusing in terms of what it covers. It's not uncommon for somebody to be hospitalized, have some type of event, a fall, or some type of medical situation, go from a hospital to a transitional care unit, and maybe they need some skilled care and they get PT. And then at that point, the healthcare providers and family decide it's not safe for this person to go home. So hospital stays and transitional care stays are covered by Medicare. But once you transition into long-term care, it means that you have a chronic condition and it's not getting better. And so when I talk about long-term care, it's usually assisted living or memory care. Sometimes it's home health care. And so long-term care is not covered by medical assistance. It would either be covered by out of pocket or by long-term care insurance. And so long-term care insurance typically covers home health care, assisted living, nursing home, um, uh, and other like non-skilled care. And individuals who require long-term care typically can't perform what are called their activities of daily living, or they need supervision because they have a cognitive deficit such as dementia. I do like to cover why it's important. And part of it because long-term care costs a lot. These are updated numbers, and I guess they're not super updated, right? It's a Genworth 2021 study, but it's hard to get really up-to-the-date numbers. So these were the most current I could get. But assisted living, a private room, can cost up to $54,000 a year. Nursing home is even more expensive. But home health care can be quite expensive too. And sometimes people find out that having somebody come into their home, especially if it has to be daily, is going to far exceed the cost of moving into assisted living. So being able to access your long-term care insurance benefits is really critical in order to cover some of these really expensive care costs. This is just a quick overview of the different types of policies. And this is important just to understand really when are you going to get paid? I would say most policies I see are what's called a reimbursement policy. And what that means is you will actually have to incur the long-term care cost first, then you submit the invoice to your insurer, and then you get repaid. And that is the structure the entire time you're on benefit. It's very different from what we're used to seeing with our medical insurance benefits. Usually, with medical insurance benefits, our doctor submits the claim, it gets paid, and we don't have to pay the doctor directly. So you will get reimbursed, but you have to kind of understand that you're going to have to front these bills initially. There are what's known as indemnity policies, and I don't see those very often, but sometimes they come with like a full monthly benefit. And usually the policyholder does not have to show the cost of their care. And so they get these benefits regardless of the cost once they qualify for them. And then there are cash indemnity benefits too. And like I said, I rarely see an indemnity policy, but if you have one, they're actually quite good. So, what are your policy benefits? And that's really important to understand. The first thing I tell people is you've got to look at your policy. These are individual contracts, and I haven't seen the same contract twice, and I've been doing this for many years. And so I see a lot of similarities, I will say that. But you want to be really careful to look at what are the benefits on your policy? Because if you recall, at the time you purchased the policy, what you chose to buy determined your premiums. And so that is why I will see differences in policies, is because people made decisions based on the cost of their benefits. Generally, I see home health care, adult daycare, assisted living, nursing home. Now, here's a really important benefit, and it's called an alternate plan of care benefit. I like to call this a catch-all benefit. So if something isn't specifically covered in your long-term care policy, you may have this catch-all. And generally it reads as, if you need this type of care and it's long-term care, we'll cover it. But this particular benefit often requires that the insurance company agree to it. A lot of times it could be modification to the home, like a ramp. It could be a hospital bed. But sometimes I've seen policies where they don't have assisted living specifically, and then they'll have an alternate plan of care. And often I can get benefits for my clients in assisted living through this alternate plan of care benefit. Oftentimes, well, I shouldn't say often, it depends. Um, you might have a situation on your policy where you can use more than one benefit at the same time. So those are important considerations. There are times that people live in assisted living and they actually require more care than the assisted living facility can provide. And maybe it makes sense to have a home health care agency come in and supplement that care that can't be provided in assisted living instead of moving the policyholder to a whole new facility like skilled nursing. So, what the benefits have will really kind of determine and help you navigate what your long-term care situation will look like. I want to go over key terminology that's going to be found in your policy. Um, right up front in the policies, you'll generally find definitions. And that's one of the first places I look at to kind of understand what benefits are at issue and what does it take to qualify. The elimination period is an important term, and really that's like a deductible. And what it means is you will have to pay for your long-term care for a certain amount of time out of pocket before the benefit payments will start happening. Typically, I've seen elimination periods of 90 to 100 days. Sometimes they're 30. Um, but usually they're a little longer. And so it's important to know so that you can plan for how much time you're going to have to pay for the benefit before your long-term care insurance company will cover it. Facility definitions. That's another thing that's really important. Understanding how they're defined. Oftentimes, they require licensure, sometimes staffing. So looking that over closely and making sure if you're going to go into assisted living, that your facility meets the definitions of your policy. The other important and key term is chronically ill. Chronically ill is how you become eligible. And chronically ill, basically, I always tell clients there's two pathways to becoming chronically ill and or eligible for benefits. One is you can't perform a certain number of your activities of daily living. Usually there's 6 activities of daily living, sometimes 5, and most insurance policies require that you cannot do 2 of the 6. Some policies will require 3 of the 6, so it's important to know. The other pathway to coverage or becoming chronically ill is having a cognitive impairment, such as dementia. And because of that impairment, you require substantial supervision to keep yourself safe. So, a lot of times, what that means is because of dementia, it's no longer safe for the policyholder to live in his or her home. And so they have to move into a facility. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to move into memory care, but typically it means they need to move into assisted living. They can't do things like prepare their meals or do medication administration, or they need welfare checks or safety checks. They may need even escorts to meals. So there's just a variety of services that can help, but it doesn't necessarily mean somebody's ready for memory care. It just means they can't live at home safely.
We do have our first question here, Elizabeth. Will you cover the average cost of these policies, or would you know some of the average cost of some of these policies?
I That is not my area. Unfortunately, I don't know the average cost of these policies. Usually, when people find me, they've owned these policies for many, many years, 20 to 30 years. I will say this, I think that long-term care insurance has become increasingly expensive because what the long-term care insurance industry has learned is that long-term care is expensive and people are living longer than, frankly, the insurance companies expected. Um, I see now different types of products associated with long-term care insurance, such as a life insurance policy with a rider, or sometimes an annuity with a long-term care insurance um, rider. And what that allows is if you purchase it, you'll have a benefit after death. So if you don't use your long-term care insurance, you're not going to lose your premiums, which is kind of the current structure of most of the policies that I see with the clients that I help.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So, other key terminology is the policy schedule, which is found at the very front of your policy. And it's going to tell you basically the value of your long term care insurance policy. It'll give you the daily maximum rate. Typically, if you're in a facility, whether it's nursing home or assisted living, it is paid out at the same daily rate. Sometimes policies pay out assisted living at a lesser daily rate. It's going to give you the maximum benefit. And so it's either going to be a period of time, like 4 or 5 years. Sometimes it's unlimited, meaning, there are no limits to your benefit, or sometimes it's done in a dollar amount. So that is important to kind of know just to get a lay of the land and understand, is my long-term care insurance coverage going to pay my full bill? And it might help you make some decisions about care costs. I did throw in another kind of key terminology, and that is the cognitive impairment. When I mentioned just previously that that was one of the pathways to being eligible or found chronically ill, policies are also going to talk about what is the severity or what's required for the cognitive impairment. A lot of times it's that your short-term memory is impacted, executive functioning is impacted, um, and other analytical skills. So it's important to kind of look at some of those definitions and really understand what are you going to have to show, whoops, your long-term care insurance company to prove that you have a claim. Okay, so I already covered a little bit of this, which was what does eligibility look like? And that is the chronically ill, and that's either you have a physical diagnosis or mental health diagnosis. Sometimes the physical diagnosis, even for older adults, if you're old enough, it doesn't even have to be Parkinson's. Sometimes as we age, we just get weak. And if the weakness leads to balance issues and an inability to safely dress ourselves or bathe ourselves, that's enough. Certainly, if there's some kind of specific physical diagnosis, that's helpful. And then for the mental diagnosis, in order to qualify for that cognitive impairment, Typically, a cognitive diagnosis is needed. It could be dementia, it could be Alzheimer's. And dementia is a very broad term. So, oftentimes, if people are experiencing short-term memory loss, confusion, inability to do things like cook or drive, follow directions, things of that nature, physicians will typically give them a diagnosis of dementia even if there isn't neuropsychological testing. So they don't have to do like a deep dive, but there should really be some documentation. So I already talked about that. I will keep moving. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of problem with my cursor. There we go. Okay. So I touched on this before when we talked about the different types of policies, but I want to kind of go back and make sure that we really understand that because like I said, most of these policies are reimbursement. There's a lot of confusion. Even my clients, after working with me, think at some point, their facility is just going to submit the bill to the insurance company and get paid. And I have to remind them that's never going to happen. You have to pay the bill first, and then the invoice goes to the insurance company, and then you get paid later. And sometimes the being paid later can be up to a month and sometimes 2 months later. So, really understanding and making sure you have resources to cover those bills up front, knowing that you're going to be paid on the back end. So, it's under in insurance terms, it's called a loss. So, you have to have the invoice, you have to have paid it. That means you've had a loss, and then you get a reimbursement. I'd like to talk a little bit now about the claims process, and that really is the beginning of trying to get your benefits. Um, so, thinking about and knowing and planning for this process, I think is really important. And what I mentioned before is the first step is really looking at your policy and understanding what benefits you have available. And please know, just because you have long-term care insurance doesn't necessarily mean you're eligible if you go into long-term care. And so those are important concepts to remember. Sometimes folks will move into long-term care because frankly it makes sense, but they're not eligible. They don't need help with two of their activities of daily living, or they don't have a severe enough cognitive impairment to need supervision. And so they kind of fall into this really kind of pre-eligibility phase, but they're already taking on these expenses. So being planful will really help. One, so that you're not surprised if you don't get benefits right away. And two, maybe you can plan so that the initial long-term care you get, maybe it isn't as expensive. I've had some clients maybe start out with home health care first before they move into assisted living. Because remember, there is this elimination period. So you will incur a significant amount of costs before insurance kicks in. So for initial claims contact, you're going to contact your insurance company. This process can look very different depending on the company. Sometimes you call in, they may do a telephone intake. I always recommend to my clients, if my clients have hired me to help them at the beginning phases of trying to get coverage, be prepared. Know what type of care you think you need. Look at your contract. If you're moving into assisted living or your loved one is moving into assisted living, really understand why and be able to answer the insurance company because they'll take in a lot of information and you might not even realize what they're asking, and it will really drive a lot of the process. So you want to make sure you're prepared. And I think looking at if you can get some of the claims forms ahead of time, that's helpful. Some companies have an online portal where you can get all the information. Some companies, you call them and they'll mail you a claims packet. So the all of the forms that you're sent and keeping track of that is very important because this really is the driver. Oh, sorry about that, of the whole process. When you call the insurance company, it's great to verify, even though you've looked over your own contract, what services are covered? What available benefits do I have? Confirm what is my daily benefit. Sometimes when you purchase insurance, you can buy what's called an inflation rider. And what that means is, what I've seen is a typical inflation rider is 5% interest compounded annually. And so what that means is that initial daily rate, let's say it was $120 at the time that the insurance was purchased. If my client has also purchased an inflation rider, then that means from the anniversary, the first anniversary, and every year, that 120 is compounded by 5%. So by the time they are getting ready to use that benefit, it could be $250, $280 a day, which is significantly more than the 120 that they purchased. So knowing what your daily benefit amount is really helpful because you can then kind of plan for and understand what expenses you have ahead of you. Knowing your confirming the elimination period, knowing what how many days you have to pay out of pocket. And then, like I mentioned, confirming if you have an inflation rider. Again, those are really important things. And a lot of times, there's been such a significant gap in time from when people have purchased their insurance policy to when they have to need it, they may forget that. Or if you're the adult son or daughter and your parents have a policy, you may not really know what they bought. So knowing, trying to get all this information up front just really helps with surprises later. Preparing for the claim, it can take several weeks or even months, which is really unfortunate. But that's what I've heard from a lot of clients. There's a lot of paperwork to gather. There's a lot of forms. There's a lot of back and forth. So you need to be ready for it and try to do a lot of front end work. Have a complete copy of the policy. Understand your benefits. Know what's at issue. Is it the ADLs? Is it unsafe to do because of a cognitive impairment? And if you have all of that ahead of time, it will make the claims process go quicker and smoother. Some key forms you're going to get from your insurance company when you initiate um, a claim. Oftentimes, they'll want a list of your medical providers and you'll sign a release. And basically, the release means that they're going to go ask for your medical records from the providers. I always suggest to my clients focus on the relevant providers. If you have some random chiropractic, appointments that really don't have anything to do with why you need to go in to long-term care, you don't need to list everybody and kind of focus in on your key providers. If it's a neurologist, or if it's a geriatrician, or or your general practitioner, whomever the policyholder has been seeing routinely is a good person to list. Um, a lot of times, insurance companies will send that physician some type of form for them to fill out, called a physician statement or certification. They'll want to know why that their patient is going into long-term care. I always suggest to clients, talk to your physician and let them know because it's not uncommon for the physician to maybe not know that you're going into long-term care or exactly why. And they may not know what your care plan is for when you go into the facility. And you want to make sure that any form they fill out is accurate. Because insurance company is going to rely on it. And if the form is filled out inaccurately, it's just a big hassle to go back and try to have your physician fill it out and make corrections. Um, Third-party authorizations. So if you're an adult son or daughter, and you're helping your mom and dad with the claims process, they're going to fill out an authorization allowing you to speak to the insurance company. And even when I'm hired, my clients have to fill out an authorization to allow the insurance company to speak to me. So filling out those authorizations ahead of time will just save you headaches later and make communication more streamlined. Also, be ready for a nursing assessment from the insurance company, once the claim is started, they will typically send out their own nurse, a vendor that they've hired to perform an assessment. And so that's something kind of to expect. And then also collecting receipts and invoices and all the care costs, and either and being ready to submit that when it's necessary to cover your expenses. Now, a lot of times they'll have the facility um, uh, submit the invoices or your home healthcare agency, but sometimes you'll need to. So you want to be prepared to have the paperwork. So when you look at when people are filling out claim forms, I like to mention to them a couple key things to remember, because there's a lot of confusion over um, what makes you eligible for long-term care. And as I already mentioned it, you have to be chronically ill, and it's very specific. And so a lot of times, um, people will think that medication management is going to help them with eligibility. But you got to remember, medication management is not an ADL. And so it's not going to be one of those things that helps you qualify. A lot of times, folks will say, well, we moved into long term care because my mom or dad's falling a lot and they need supervision. That is not going to qualify you for long-term care either, that supervision for falling. Now, they may be things that are happening, and they may bear into other aspects of your eligibility, but in and of themselves, they are not going to help you qualify. What you want to focus in on for the claim form is really kind of mirroring contract language. Is there a diagnosis that supports the care needs? If the policyholder says Parkinson's, that's an important diagnosis to put down. Or if there's dementia, or if there's congestive heart failure. Sometimes people have that and it causes them to be weak. Whatever diagnosis, sometimes macular degeneration, especially if somebody's nearly blind, and now all of a sudden they can't dress themselves or bathe themselves because they can't see. And so, whatever's causing that person to need the help, I think it's important to put on the claim form. On claim forms, a lot of times they'll have comments. There'll be a lot of check the boxes, but there'll be places for comments too. Be as complete as possible. Give as much information as you can when filling out these forms. The more information, the better, just to fully explain why long-term care is needed. And then again, focusing on the ADLs or the supervision for safety. When I think of supervision for safety, I always talk to clients and help them think about what are all the reasons that your mom and dad can't live at home? What's causing you to move him or her into an assisted living facility? Usually, there's been a whole bunch of situations that have led to that point in time. They can no longer do their finances. They are no longer driving. They don't can't go to doctor's appointments by themselves because they're not accurate historians. They can't give themselves their own medication. Now, although medication management is not an ADL, it is one of the things I like to focus in on if somebody's not safe to be alone and they need supervision. I mean, um, it's not uncommon for some of my clients to have gotten into a serious situation taking too many of their prescribed medications or not enough, or different ones at different times, and then having to be hospitalized. So that would be important information. And anything you can think of. Usually, my clients with dementia, they can't do their own laundry, they can't do their own housekeeping, they can't make their own meals. Um, and then all of that kind of collectively supports their inability to live safely at home and needing supervision. Because in a facility, even people coming into the apartment to collect the garbage or do the laundry, they have eyes on that policyholder. And if something were to happen, they could grab a nurse very quickly and make sure that that person was safe. This is incredibly important and sometimes something people kind of forget to do, and that is keep a copy of everything you submit. It's really common to put together all your documentation, send it off to the insurance company, and not have a record of what you sent in. And then if there's a dispute later, you really don't know what you gave them. As a lawyer, I keep copies of everything I send, all my emails, all my correspondence, everything. And I highly recommend that people do that as well. You just don't know when you're going to need it and need to refer it because guess what? Insurance companies lose stuff, they make mistakes. And if you have a copy of what you submitted, it could help you in the long run if you run into a problem later. So, this is just kind of a recap of things you need to think about and remember and do. When you go to make a claim, either for yourself or family member, alert your medical providers. Have them know what's going on because the insurance company will get their medical records. They'll also send forms to them. So if they know what's coming, they'll be prepared to answer the questions and the forms as best they can and in a helpful way to give all relevant information. The insurer's own nursing assessment is likely going to happen. And remember, it's conducted by a third party, but that party works for the insurance company. A family member should be present. I've sat in on a couple nursing assessments of my clients, and what ends up happening is people want to present as far more independent than they actually are. And so I've seen my clients readily say that they can do all of their activities of daily living by themselves, but in reality, they can't. They often need standby assistance, if not direct assistance, because even with a chronic condition, how you are feeling on any particular day can vary. Some days people are a little stronger than other days. And so, even preparing for that nursing assessment, you want to think about your needs in the context of what's your worst day, not your best day. And these are situations to really be clear about what your needs are. And again, no one wants to admit that they are dependent on somebody else to help care for them, but it is important. I mean, your insurance coverage is not going to pay for your long-term care if the policyholder says they're independent. Um, and usually they aren't because they've already gone through a nursing assessment at the facility they're at. So um, it's just one of those situations that's human nature and you need to kind of think about and prepare for. Sometimes there's additional evaluations that could be helpful for a long-term care insurance claim. Occupational therapy evaluations. A lot of times they will look at and do assessments for ADLs, or sometimes occupational therapists also do cognitive assessments. Another assessment would be a psychological evaluation. Um, it's not completely common, but I would say a fair amount of my clients with dementia do have a neuropsych eval. These evaluations are really helpful in understanding all the deficits. When somebody goes to their neurologist and they have dementia, they're only seeing their neurologist for a short period of time, and the neurologist really is not going to have a deep understanding of all the different problems that are happening because of the dementia. A neuropsychological evaluation is usually a couple hours. It's done by a neuropsychologist, and they'll really kind of examine and test the policyholder in a variety of ways to really understand where the cognitive problems lie. From my experience, most of my clients start to show what's called executive functioning deficits before the memory deficits really present strongly. And when we're talking about executive functioning, that means they start struggling with paying their bills. They start struggling with paperwork, banking, making mistakes. Sometimes they fall victim to a financial scam. There's a whole variety of things that kind of are impacted by our executive functioning that we just don't realize. And I see that as kind of the first thing to become problematic. But it's also the executive functioning that keeps us safe. That's what helps us be able to reason about things. That's what helps good executive functioning, frankly, often avoid financial scams. And so those are important things to think about and consider, in the context of long-term care insurance and what kind of evaluation is needed. So let's talk about what happens once eligibility is approved. And remember, eligibility is different from payment. Eligibility is the point in time they say that the policyholder is chronically ill. And then once, you've been determined to be chronically ill, then then the elimination period kicks in. So payment doesn't start right away. But a couple kind of logistical things that I always tell my clients to make sure is, if you've set up an electronic transfer of funds, um, make sure that your banking information is correct. The insurance company will send out a form and they're going to want to have you set up electronic transfers, which is how most of my clients are paid for their reimbursement. And there's been a couple times where the banking routing number was incorrect or the account number. So make sure that those forms are accurate. Make sure you're getting those to your insurance company in a timely way. You also want to be coordinating with your long-term care provider and figuring out who at that provider's organization will be submitting the invoices and understanding what their process is so you don't run into any hiccups. Um, Oftentimes, in addition to the invoice, um, if the policyholder is living at a facility, they'll also have what's called a confinement form that needs to be submitted. So facilities want to know how many days has that person been there? Um, because usually when you get an invoice for long-term care, if you're at assisted living facility, for instance, let's say you're living there, but you have to be hospitalized for a few days. You have an infection or there's a problem. Well, your long-term care facility, the assisted living facility, is not going to deduct whatever days you were gone. You're just going to get a full bill. But long-term care insurance is not going to pay for your care when you're away from your facility. So they will send in what's called confinement forms. And then when the facility fills out what's called a confinement form, they'll kind of detail how many days that the policyholder was in the facility. So things to keep track of. Along those lines, I was talking about benefits. I didn't cover one benefit, which is called a bed reservation benefit. I don't see this a lot on policies, but occasionally I do, and it is a helpful benefit because if you are away from the facility for hospitalization or maybe just to go on vacation with your family, the long-term care insurance company will not pay for those days you're gone. However, if you have a bed reservation benefit, you can use that benefit to cover the days you're gone. Usually the bed reservation benefit is limited in time. So I've seen where my clients will have, say, 21 days during a calendar year. So if they're gone more than 21 days, they now aren't eligible to get, reimbursed for those extra days. But that's an important benefit to think about. Also, remember that eligibility is ongoing. So once the policyholder is determined eligible, usually the insurance company will do another assessment either in 6 months to a year. And it may be another outside nursing assessment. They may contact the facility or the home health care agency to make sure that nothing's changed. They'll likely ask for updated releases and they'll want to get updated medical records to see what's going on with the policyholder or the insured. I always tell my clients, because usually when they come to me, maybe they've had an eligibility problem and I help them get on coverage, but I tell them afterwards, you still have to stay really diligent. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for a policyholder to be found ineligible after they were already found eligible. Now, it probably doesn't make sense, does it? Because if you have a long-term care, if you're in long-term care and you have a chronic problem that's not getting better, why would you be found ineligible? Well, a lot of times it's basically a snafu in paperwork. Sometimes what ends up happening is you get a second nurse assessment, and maybe this time it's done without a family member present, and it's just the policyholder. And it's not uncommon for the policyholder to tell the nurse, hey, I can do everything on my own. I don't need help with bathing and dressing anymore. And then all of a sudden, the policyholder's found ineligible. Unfortunately, a lot of times the care plan still is the same. They do need help with bathing and dressing. It's just they've represented themselves as far more independent. So in those situations, you can kind of unring that bell and go back to being eligible, but it does create some problems and it creates, a gap in payment. Um, so checking in with the long-term care and medical providers periodically, seeing if they've gotten requests for updated insurance forms, if there is another nursing assessment, making sure family members are always there or somebody is always there with the policyholder to make sure that that nurse is getting accurate information. And then all contact with the insurer, I recommend that it be documented. Keep call notes, keep documentation, check in with the insurance company, and make sure, you don't want to um, be surprised if there's a determination of ineligibility because you haven't kept up on some of the paperwork. So now I want to shift gears and just talk briefly about what happens if you're found not eligible or there's a denial. Here are some of the common reasons for denials. Um, Insurance companies saying really there's no cognitive impairment or it's not severe enough that you be in a facility or that you don't meet the ADL requirement, or maybe that your facility doesn't meet the policy definition or licensure requirements. Sometimes they'll say it's not medically necessary. The no prior hospitalizations. I will say this, in really old policies, there used to be a requirement that you be hospitalized first for a period of time before you go into long-term care. What I've seen more recently is that those terms no longer really exist. So that doesn't pop up hardly ever, or no care by family members. That can vary too. Some policies have a strict prohibition that family members can't give the care, while other policies don't. So understanding the policy and knowing what's required. But those are the common reasons that I typically see when people will come to me with a need for help. Now I'm going to talk you through one of my cases, so you can have some context of what the denials will look like and kind of how to overcome a denial and get back to coverage. In this particular case, my client, Doris, and her husband were on the same policy, um, which is kind of unique. Um, Doris's husband was on a rider to her policy. So basically, if she was eligible for benefits, then he would be eligible for benefits. So Doris's husband was moved into a skilled nursing facility and really had quite high needs. 6 months later, she moved into assisted living facility. And before she moved in, a nurse came to her home and actually did a really good job assessing Doris. Doris had really weak hands and she had a lot of difficulty with fine motor skills. She couldn't wring out a cloth, she couldn't wash her body. And she also had extreme difficulty dressing herself. She couldn't manipulate zippers or buttons. And so after the nursing assessment was concluded, the nurse for the insurance company determined that Doris qualified and was eligible because she couldn't bathe or dress herself, which is two of her activities of daily living. So at that point, once Doris became eligible for benefit, so did her husband, Harry. And that really was, their benefits were worth a lot of money because Harry's care costs were really expensive. So not too long after Doris moved into her facility, oh, okay. Sorry, I'm going to go back. So this is more details on the pre-admission assessment where Doris was had a nurse come out to her home before she moved into the facility. And like I mentioned, it was very well done. It took several hours. The nurse had Doris perform all of her activities of daily living and really did an in-depth analysis of Doris's needs. And the reason I want to kind of talk about this assessment is I'm going to kind of do a compare and contrast. So ultimately, she qualified. However, about 6 months later, the insurance company sent out a second nurse to assess Doris. And this was after Doris had already moved into the facility. When I was contacted, the family had no idea that Doris was assessed again, and they just received a denial letter, which was really surprising to them. So, with the second assessment, and here's some other information. So, by the time Doris moved into assisted living, and I mentioned she really had a lot of difficulty with zippers and laces and fasteners. She had started wearing really simple clothes. She started just wearing sweats and slippers. So these were things she could just pull on herself. And so the nursing records at her facility inaccurately concluded that Doris could, dress herself, which wasn't accurate because she really couldn't. I mean, if you can't do zippers and buttons, you can't dress yourself. If you make changes and wear pajamas all day, that's not dressing yourself. That's just making an accommodation for a disability. And so that was a problematic document from the assisted living. But with the second nurse assessor, she came to the facility to meet with Doris, and all she did was ask her questions. She didn't have Doris perform any of the activities of daily living. She didn't have Doris show if she could zipper a coat or button or do fasteners. And Doris said, "Yeah, I can dress myself." And so after that nursing assessment, Doris was denied coverage. And because Doris was denied coverage, Harry was denied coverage. So all of a sudden, Doris and Harry went from receiving full benefits for both of their facility stays to receiving no benefits, which was had a really huge impact financially on the family. Um, Ultimately, we were able to resolve it. Um, and what it amounted to is really talking to the facility and having talking to the nurse and having her evaluate um, Doris and understanding that in fact Doris couldn't dress herself and really making sure Doris's care plan was accurate. So really it was me kind of helping clean up and making sure we had all the right documentation. And so ultimately, the good news was we could go back to the date that Doris was found ineligible. So they didn't miss any benefits. We got back benefits. But there was that gap in time where, they had to incur a lot of fees. And frankly, it was probably nerve-wracking because they weren't sure where it was going to go. Um, so keys to coverage is always gathering, the documents that you need, knowing the insurance claims process, and listing assistance early on. Making sure your physician knows what's going on, making sure the facility staff knows what's going on, or if needed, getting some legal advocacy to help you. These benefits can amount to a lot of money. I've had several clients where I've had gotten back benefits, of over $100,000, and that's a lot of money to incur out of pocket. And so, the hurdles can be overcome, but you do have to be diligent. So at this point, I'm done. And if folks have questions, I am happy to answer them.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah. That was absolutely fantastic, Ms. Well, thank you so much. So yeah, if anybody has any questions in the chat, we can go ahead and start typing those now. I'll give it a minute. If we don't see any, I think we can wrap it up for the day and make sure everyone stays indoors because it's awfully nasty out today. So,